Hello and welcome to this book launch sponsored by the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University. I'm Madeleine Doby, Professor of French and Comparative Literature and Chair of the Department of French at Columbia. And I am truly delighted to be here to moderate this discussion of my colleague Kaiama Glover's new book, A Regarded Self, Caribbean Womanhood and the Ethics of Disorderly Being, which is just out with Duke University Press. A Regarded Self explores 5 Caribbean writers' depictions of women who resist pressures to conform to the constraints and dictates of collective politics and tenaciously assert their personal and creative freedoms. It's a courageous book that navigates through minefields of race, gender, and class while presenting literary readings that are both synthetic and original. It's also a timely contribution to a new body of scholarship on questions of race and freedom. Our discussion today will be kicked off by Kaiama, who will give an overview of her book's principal questions and approach. After that, 3 discussants will share their perspectives. When Kaiama's had a chance to respond, there will be some time for questions from the audience. If you have a question or a comment, please write it in the Q&A, and I will read it for you when we get to that stage. Before handing over to Kaiama, I'd like to introduce her and the 3 esteemed colleagues who will be commenting on A Regarded Self. And I'm going to keep these introductions brief in order to allow more time for discussion. Kaiama L. Glover is Anne Whitney Olin Professor of French and Africana Studies and Faculty Director of the Digital Humanities Center at Barnard College. She is the author of Haiti Unbound, a spiralist challenge to the postcolonial canon, published in 2010 by Liverpool University Press. And she's the editor of The Haiti Reader, which came out with Duke University Press last year. She has also edited a special issue of Yale French Studies on Marie Chauvet in 2016, and is currently working on another special issue on Maryse Condé, and it's my privilege to be working with her on that project. Kaiama has also authored several distinguished translations of works of fiction and nonfiction from French to English, notably Franck Etienne's Ready to Burst, Marie Chauvet's Dance on the Volcano, René Depestre's Adriana in All My Dreams, and Françoise Vergès's The Wombs of Women, Capitalism, Racialization, Feminism. And she's completing translations of Mabula Sumaharo's memoir, Black is the Journey, and Yannick Lahance's novel, Sweet Undoings. Kaiama has contributed regularly to the New York Times Book Review, and she's been a host on the PBS program, History Detectives Special Investigations. After Kaiama presents her book, we'll be turning to Régine Michel Jean-Charles, who is Associate Professor of French at Boston College. Régine's book, Conflict Bodies, The Politics of Rape Representation in the Francophone Imaginary, was published in 2014. Her current book project is on Black feminism and literary ethics in Haitian fiction. The second discussant will be Yvette Christiansen, who is Anne Whitney Olin Professor of English and Africana Studies at Barnard College. And she is the author of Toni Morrison and Ethical Poetics, published in 2013. And a noted poet and librettist. Finally, we'll hear from Saidia Hartman, who since 2020 has been university professor at Columbia University. She is the author of several influential books, including Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America from 1997, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, 2006, and most recently, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval. So welcome and thank you to all 3 discussants for being here. Kaiama, congratulations on this achievement, and now over to you.
I will begin with thanks. Thanks to you first, Madeleine, for that beautiful introduction and that very considered and thoughtful way of bringing us into this space together. I also want to thank Eileen Galuli, who invited me into the Society of Fellows, the Heyman Center, for this conversation, to Kelly McKinney and Kay Zhang for all of their work bringing this group together and sorting out the logistics of this conversation. Thank you to all of you out there who have found the time for yet another Zoom at the end of this week. I sincerely appreciate that. And thank you to my three co-panelists here who by agreeing to do this have made launching a new book into the void of this moment feel like far less of an echo chamber of an experience. And I really am so very grateful that you've found the time to do this and to spend a little time with my book. There are many other thanks, but you can read them should you pick up the book. In my acknowledgements, I mean every word of them, and I've done my best to name all of the folks who have been a part of what it took to get to the point of publishing this book. So thank you. So the book, A Regarded Self. As I stated at the very beginning, A Regarded Self is meant to be a book about freedom and about what I see as the life and death stakes of adamant selfhood. The premise is what I've been thinking about is the unseemliness of the I. It's an expression I borrow from a feminist, Adriana Cabrero. The I that declares itself, the discomfort that's produced by a declarative self, especially a declarative feminine self. And the book is meant to be an inquiry into both the why of that discomfort, as well as into the possible ethical legitimacy of such self-declaration. And it's situated in the geocultural space of the Caribbean, which is obviously a space that is marked historically by contestation, by fierce struggle to resist the individualist nature of racial capitalism and North Atlantic empire. And in that way, a space where I argue there is and has been a particular reliance on the communal as a resource and as a social and aesthetic principle. In a lot of ways, this book actually follows on my, and maybe it's not that obvious, but nonetheless, in my brain, at least, it follows on my earlier work on the centers and margins that have been created in the Caribbean, in Caribbean literary traditions, as they write back to Europe. And I've wanted to think here about how an emphasis or even an insistence on the communal can in fact be dangerously prescriptive for certain disorderly beings. And by disorderly, of course, I mean morally ambivalent beings, politically non-aligned or sexually unconventional beings, women specifically, who are self-regarding, wayward, and wild. And you all will realize, I'm sure, that I use those terms, self-regarding, wayward, and wild, very specifically to point to other works of critical theory, or three in particular works of critical theory that emerged in a similar time space to the one that produced A Regarded Self. Literally, as I was wrapping up this manuscript, Toni Morrison's essay collection, The Source of Self-Regard, its ideas, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, and then Jack Halberstam's Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, they all came out in sort of rapid succession. And at first I found that incredibly daunting. I have to say, the summer of 2019, when the source of Self-Regard came out, I was kind of like, maybe I just shouldn't do this. But then, you know, it's also felt like kind of a confirmation that maybe I'm onto something here, something to do with questions of disorder and the seeking out of ways of thinking and being that resist reliable classification. And so, you know, at the origins of this book and at its foundations, I've wanted to think about who we ask to do what kind of work for us, situated here in a largely righteous, largely progressive community of professional readers. You know, what do we do with texts that seem to be set up to fit into our traditions and our politics as Caribbeanists, as Black feminists, as progressive thinkers, but that maybe disappoint or even enrage us? And so in other words, I've been curious to unpack what these works and the women they contain have elicited as a critical response, especially among critical communities that I belong to. You know, communities of folks whose work I admire and engage regularly as a scholar, as an educator, as a translator, etc. And so throughout A Regarded Self, throughout the project, I'm asking that we think about the work of criticism we do as theorists and about the gendered and racialized expectations we bring to our characters, to our writers in that sort of beloved and possessive way that after, you know, decades of working with these texts, we tend to feel about them in some ways. And then to do this thinking, what I tried to do in the book is to create a conversation among these 5 works of prose fiction and the authors who made them. So that's Maryse Condé with I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, Marie Chauvet, Daughter of Haiti, René Depestre, Adriana in All My Dreams, Jamaica Kincaid, the autobiography of my mother, and Marlon James, the Book of Night Women. And I've read these books together in the hopes of creating some space for critical reflexivity, for vigilance to the desires that animate our ways of reading and writing about and teaching postcolonial Caribbean literature. And then also vigilance to the fact of consumption that is an inevitable part of reading and wanting to identify with fictional characters whose stories recall the things we cherish in some ways. And the book is also a reflection of my thinking and even, I guess, my frustration to some extent around the ways that the Caribbean is often muted by US Black studies, which do tend to stand in for global Blackness in sort of the wider world. And so part of the project has been to attend to the specificity of the Caribbean while also trying to gesture outward from that space. So thinking about the matters of coloniality, of métissage and Frenchness, the relationship to empire and the hemispheric Americas, and of the particularity of majority Blackness, of indigeneity, all of these sort of idiosyncratically Caribbean preoccupations that can be too easily elided, I think, by US American perspectives on gender and race. And maybe, I think I do have time, I'll just give a very quick overview for folks who haven't read the book. There are 5 chapters in addition to the intro and the conclusion, and each of the chapters sort of takes up a specific valence of self-regard as a way of thinking about and through a particular work of Caribbean literature, the context of its writing, and then the dimensions of its extra-textual application. And so, again, quickly, the first chapter, which focuses on Maryse Condé's Tituba, looks at self-love as a way of examining the past and the present constraints of Puritanism, at the genre of the slave narrative, and at the blind spots of feminism, as well as at the matter of the erotic in the context of enslavement. And then in the second chapter on Marie Chauvet's Daughter of Haiti, I use self-possession to tackle voodoo and the fetishizing of whiteness in the Afro-Caribbean, as well as the tyranny of political desire. The third chapter on Adriana dans tous mes rêves thinks through, I'm sorry, I switched chapters. The second chapter is self-defense. Madeline's nodding. Yeah, like I thought so. Yes, the second chapter is self-defense, and that's where I'm thinking about color politics actually in Haiti and mid-century Haitian nationalism. I also have a little veering into questions of BDSM and other modes of what I think of as sexual contract. It's then in Adriana that I think more about voodoo, whiteness in the Afro-Caribbean, and political desires as they impacted both the reception of the novel and the perception of its author. In the fourth chapter, which focuses on Jamaica Kincaid's autobiography of my mother, I think about self-preservation in a very literal sense, examining the intramural conflict around indigeneity. And I have a lot of fun querying the Tempest narrative, both Shakespeare's and Aimé Césaire's. And then in the final chapter, which really explicitly engages with self-regard in the sense of looking and being looked at, I use or think through Marlon James's The Book of Night Women to home in on present-day investments in the haunting past of slavery. Again, the neo-slave narrative as well, and again, the experience or thinking through erotics in the context of enslavement. And yes, the whole thing relies on the matter of regard for self. And I really do squeeze all the connotative juice I can out of that term, self-regard. So I posit it in contradistinction to the colonialist and the masculine gaze, as well as to the need for approval among communities of color, feminist and Black feminist writerly communities. I think of self-regard as an opportunity for mirror work in a very literal way. And I think about self-regard as a form of healthy narcissism and of deliberate disorder in both the literal psychiatric and the more metaphorical sense of that term. And so with all of this, I get that there's maybe a lot about the project that risks being off-putting. It took me a while to not put the word narcissism in the title, actually. I was kind of talked down from what might have been a mistake. By foregrounding a concept or a term that evokes immediately a certain amount of pushback or reluctance. And maybe putting also in the context of these times where we rely ever more, and rightly so, on community to shore us up in the face of some of the more egregious individualist practices of exploitation, extraction, and all the things everyone in this on this Zoom panel and likely in this Zoom webinar are well aware of. And I'm aware that I'm not proposing anything like answers or a clear alternative political agenda, as well as pointedly not claiming that these novels are doing that either. But what I have been invested in is clearing some space to consider the ethical legitimacy of unformed and solitary refusal, of just saying, no, I don't want to, no, I can't, or no, I won't. Yeah, and these are weird things to say, especially for women to say, and especially for Black and brown women to say. And it's surprising, or maybe not, to what extent even the most progressive communities have trouble accepting this kind of refusal from women, from Black and brown women. And this is the bind that I try to dig into in this book through these texts. And to end, just to say that, that this book is indulgently literary. It's really a testament to how gleefully I read and puzzle and geek out over good old-fashioned literary fiction as a truly personally nourishing practice of translating and panning for golden insights. Reading is a source of that endorphin rush of intimate eurekas that I experienced as I was going back to these texts that I knew well, but perhaps before starting this book hadn't thought of in such an unsettling way, I suppose. But I do just wanted to put into the space to say that being with these works and with these difficult characters, learning and teaching from them as I wrote the book, has really brought me no small degree of true pleasure. And I have really thrilled to the disorderliness of these novels and these characters. What I've read is their call to unsettle everything endlessly. And I had hoped in the book, In a Regarded Self, to communicate some of that feeling, some of that pleasure to my readers. And so, yes, now I suppose Regine, Yvette, and Saidia will let me know how close I got to meeting that goal. So I'll hand it over to you, Regine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. And thank you for writing this book. I definitely got the sense of the pleasure and the enjoyment as well. So the first sentence of Kaiama Glover's luminous study declares that this is a book about freedom. And so I want to take this time to reflect on what this freedom requires of us as a reader, as a scholar, as a critic, as a Caribbeanist, and as a feminist. What does your freedom require? Or what does freedom look like is a question I often ask my students and ask that they constantly return to. It is a question demanding that we summon our imaginations to create visions of freedom. Yet it is one that I had not realized how infrequently I had absorbed to be part of my own scholarly praxis. Indeed, the readings that unfold in A Regarded Self invite us to grapple with what our freedom requires, to wrestle with the meaning of freedom, to probe and pressure the idea of academic freedom, which deserves to be more capacious than we are now fond of framing it. With The Regarded Self, Glover does what she describes these authors as doing by, quote, calling on us to broaden our understanding of what freedom looks like, end quote. While Glover astutely performs the refusal she also analyzes in her protagonist and authors, this reader was reluctant to accept refusal as a critical stance, despite my guide's careful instruction to abandon the shackles of my own rehearsed reading praxis and critical stances. As a Black feminist literary scholar well-versed in Francophone literatures, I was familiar with many of these novels and their unlikable female protagonists, especially Adriana, Tituba, and Lotus, none of whom were my favorites, and all of whom I resisted and refused entry into my teaching, research, and theoretical frameworks, reading and rereading practices. Content to contain them within the roles I had conscripted for them, I simply refused to welcome these women into my mind. While delving into A Regarded Self, I continued to resist and refuse. Glover's corpus had a disordering effect on me from the beginning. I had no desire to lean into the unsettling dimensions of these disorderly women. and I was comfortably accepting of my refusal. I was exasperated by Tituba's and revolutionary impulses. I refused to see Adriana as anything other than a fetishized anti-Haitian version of the erotic. I did not want to consider the possibility that Lilith shows us that, quote, not all enslaved women sought alliance on feminist terms, end quote. Each of these women's experiences with sexual violence, experience sexual violence and interact with the sexual trauma in ways that are the opposite of the rape victim survivors that I foreground in my own analyses of global rape culture. But if the protagonists gathered in Glover's exquisite study repelled me, the idea of self-regard drew me in. When viewed in relation to Toni Morrison's The Source of Self-Regard, Glover's conceptualization of self-regard, even in relation to narcissism, was in my view a cause worthy of analysis. As Morrison explains, quote, the desire for choice in partners, the desire for romantic love operate as a place, space, a way for individual reclamation of the self. That is part, maybe the largest part, certainly an important part of the reconstruction of identity, part of the me, so tentatively articulated in Beloved, end quote. Because the authorial I's that Glover excavates are far from tentatively articulated, they actually beckon a reader like me to abandon my carefully honed resistance and refusal. By the study's conclusion, I was convinced that, as Glover notes, narcissism operates as, quote, a defensive practice, not a character flaw. It is both a weapon and a shield in a battle for life and death, and an ethical practice, end quote. I was convinced largely because I slowly realized that Glover was in fact introducing me to greater freedom and effectively my Black feminist critical lens to accommodate figures I was hesitant to welcome in. How could I not admire what she calls, quote, Tituba's consistent effort to refocus the gaze of others and that points to a form of freedom that aims at recognizing oneself and being recognized as a lovable being, end quote. In fact, Tituba's self-love, empowerment, and erotic self-agency is a laudable model of sexual selfhood, even if it does not adhere to the conventional modes of what freedom might look like for an enslaved woman. As for Adriana and René Depestre, both of whom I had long found suspect, Glover's careful elucidation of how the novel, quote, at once stages and interrogates the cliched objectification of women, and, quote, prompted me to rethink my longstanding resistance to this novel. At Glover's invitation, I leaned into what I found uncomfortable and unsettling about Adriana and All My Dreams and allowed it to brush up against the unexpected pleasures of that text. In particular, the hilarious nature, its hilarious nature at the levels of form and content, which allowed me to see what Depestre is parodying rather than embracing, as Glover argues. By abandoning my refusal to look more closely at the nuanced inner workings of that novel, I was finally able to accept what is in fact what Glover calls, quote, Depestre's provocative invitation into a richly layered conversation, end quote. If I had heretofore resisted embracing Chauvet's protagonist Lotus Delgrave, it was because, unlike Minette in Dance on the Volcano, Rose Normile, or even Claire Clamont in Love, Anger, Madness, I found her petulant and nothing more than, quote, a frivolous Haitian girl who plays at revolution, seeing her as a manifestation of Chauvet's critique of how power, politics, gender, and the erotic collide for women with very few choices in the context of the confining models of womanhood illuminated me. If I'm now able to see Lotus's evolution in a different light, it is because I understand and am more empathetic about the coerced loss of self that results in her self-effacement. Furthermore, Glover's insistent that Chauvet's representation of, quote, the violent encounters that take place in intimate spaces, quote, was radical in its time, and as Glover says, still is, actually entreats us to not be anachronistic in our readings of radicalism. It is also important that these protagonists endure and sometimes flourish in periods of extreme isolation, which suggests that self-regard as a form of protection and self-defense for the individual does not require the collective and the communal, as Glover continues to insist. The feminist insight that a regarded self wisely dispenses is that there are, quote, many possible ways of being, end quote, and that we not only owe it to literary characters and to our readings to explore those possibilities, but we owe it to ourselves. After all, and as Morrison has argued in The Source of Self-Regard, there is a progression as we move in all of our education from information to knowledge to wisdom. With a regarded self, Glover exemplifies that journey of progression and invites the reader, the student, and the critic to do the same. If Marlon James insists that we enact our own practice of refusal, as Glover says, Glover insists that we interrogate and unsettle our acts of refusal as well. For me right now, this means that after years of refusing to do so, thanks to Kaiama, I will be teaching I Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, for the first time. I look forward to seeing how Tituba will disorient my students, knowing that we will be just fine. If you can't be free, be a mystery, Farah Jasmine Griffin instructs, riffing off of Rita Dove's poem Canary in reference to Billie Holiday. As Griffin explains, choosing to be a mystery is one way to maintain a semblance of control, to keep your inner self to yourself. This is an act of agency for the unfree, end quote. The forms of control and agency enacted by the unfree women who make up the corpus of a regarded self navigate the mysteries and frustrations of the self, and in so doing, invite us all to become more free.
Thank you, Regine. Yvette, let me hand over to you. And just as a reminder, if anyone has a question that they'd already like to put in the Q&A, please feel free and go ahead.
Thank you. So thank you, Kaiama, for this book, and thank you to the Society of Fellows, and hats off to Duke, right? I'm going to begin with a cliche. It's about where to begin. So it's which of the many dandelion seeds of thought to grasp as this book sets them free. No matter what choice, there is the book's guidance, and it's a conversation. It's to commune, to put the verb back in the noun. This is foremost a book in which a reader, scholar, teacher, reader is in conversation, and in conversation that reveals the intersection between the ethical and the moral, if in fact it doesn't insert itself as a hinge. This is the life of the book. There's a tantalizing possibility of entering an early conversation in the book that Kaiama Glover has with, say, Butler, Foucault, Fanon, about self-reconstruction, social critique, social transformation, and that gravitational pull of the social good, the ethical, the moral. There is the conversation you could pick up for which Condé's La Parole des Femmes is a hinge, right? It's a hinge to the circle, excuse me, I'm sorry, a hinge to the circle of Alan Cheng, Jackie Alexander, Cardella Phillips, Saidiya Hartman, Hortense Spiller, which also draws in Glissant, Lamine, Césaire. And the lesson of the circling is how Kaiama Glover navigates all these points of theoretical convergence and then transforms into generative opening the points of divergence. So Alexander and Condé's acknowledgement and critique of, say, a reinvented patriarchal prerogative, for example, is one of those points of a conversation that can sustain diversion in a generative way. There's the tantalizing direction that could be taken of noting how this book offers up a reconnection with the afterlives of Fanon that converge right now around this trilogy of the new publications edited by Jean, I pronounce Khafar, and Robert Young. Every one of these conversations and directions is brought to liveliness in what might truly clumsily be articulated as Kaiama Glover's mastery of mastery, in this sustained, nuanced, and yes, elegantly fierce interrogation of accusations that are marshaled against women who define self-care according to their own light, which clumsy formation, mastery of mastery, immediately begs a neologism, which is true to the spirit of this book and which is missing in my own lexicon, a neologism which would refuse mastery and heroism, as this book does, in the performance of an anti-colonialist errantry whose organizing concept, errantry, calls for a form of contest and challenge that is always already masculine and even chivalric, right? And there's another tantalizing direction you could go in that would pause to note how a reader, scholar, teacher, reader so adeptly multilingual reads across languages to make available to monolingual readers the works to which they might otherwise not have had access. And then there's another direction. It's the reading the women in the novels themselves, reading Tituba's self-announcement, Hadriana's refusal of zombification in order to begin to live from within outward, through what Kaiama Glover calls the contours of Hadriana's sexuality. And then there's that X marks the spot of Joela's name, right? And its textual disruptions. And then you could think of their self-announcements, and thinking of them encourage you, for example, to pursue an unexpected etymological history that would move us through the Old French mostre, which meant prodigy and marvel, to its reshaping in Middle French to the name for the disfigured, the misshapen, and to hear in that transformation the force of accusation that might culminate in the word witch, the accusers always being the ones who commit the violence that they accuse the witch of committing. The act of accusation is its own act of disfiguring. And one remembers then the need to turn away, because regard is also regard, radiance, it is a radiance. So you could do what I've done, is get stuck then in one particular place, and that is a glorious place to be, which is thinking of a dance and the dancer. The dancer's body, like these women, a body that is given to be seen, that gives itself to be seen, but nevertheless resists folding the author creators into their own work, and thereby turning their work into a crypt that is always already wanting to be celebrated as an alternative site of monumentality. Rather, with Kaiama Glover's reading, this given to be seen or giving to be read shares something with the dancing body of the woman who, let's say, has been raped, and who says, I dance in front of you and you have to look at me, you cannot look away. And I dance as I wish. As long as I dance, you cannot disappear me. And neither can you fold me into some heroic narration about your grand way of recouping me, and thereby recouping yourself as a community. And like Regine, I could not look away from these dancing figures. And I think that there's something else that you could just spend time on, and that is the way that Kaiama Glover's engagement with narration itself counters the vortex that narration can create in order to stabilize itself, right? That is, that the compulsion to self-direct toward an arrival at a distinct moment, a conclusion, if you like, no matter what the parameters of the conclusion are, there's a way that the forces that have been motivated, that then take over and motivate themselves, and that work characters arrive and converge and settle in something that could be balanced, they lived happily ever after, or it could be something open-ended, like a house that is opened because there's been a death and the body has left, and that house then is open and maybe leads you to a riverside at which you find these footprints that come and go and come and go. Kaiama Glover, in conversation also with Morrison, in conversation with Condé at every turn, it's with Morrison at every turn. And what do those footprints belong to? Someone, a someone who defies every form that your longing may ask of her. Can we even call her her? You cannot take your longing to her, and your longing is exposed as an expectation of explanation, of an accounting you can take and fold into a key that shuts that troubling door of that open house. The door, a rule in itself, right, to close upon the unruly. So there's another way in that there's a moment in this book where Kaiama Glover is reading Tituba, referring to her desire as an instinct that made her a woman. And that's also about narrative, I'm thinking of poiesis and making, right? The instinct is poiesis has a narrative force. It tells even this remarkable woman, Tituba, what she is feeling and desiring. And it comes with its grammar and syntax of subjects, objects, and actions that all conjoin and are conjoined by those copulas, right? That make her into a woman who should respond as she does, and who actually what we discover in the way that Kaiama Glover takes us back to this book is also a woman learning. And she's not a fully formed, distinctly shaped, complete person. There's also a way that I just want to close with, and that is how the historical real is summoned. You know, in your remarks, you talked about capitalism, and there's this the Atlantic economy. The record of the historical real obeys its own rules of engagement, if you like, which need not be articulated. They're so encrypted. And yet, they have been fictionalizing by omission. This is what this fabulous conversation of this book made me think at 3 o'clock this morning. Yes, there was a woman who is recorded as Tituba. Yes, the record also names her as slave. The conversation in the regard itself magnifies the fiction of the historical record, whose beginning, development, and ending are Tituba, Black woman, slave. Insert which if you want, or any other accusation, nothing changes, right? As Kaiama Glover implies, slave and Black women are twinned into the narrative of Atlantic chattel slavery, which relied upon its blackening fictions. In other words, the conversation into which a regarded self invites a reader is also an invitation to remember how riven with distorted fictions the historical real is. The women conjured in the novels that Kaiama Glover makes us look at and not try to fold into our joyous possession of the world, right, may be, for the most part, focused on the present, but there's also no denying that the historical real, the long history exists. It just has to be put in its place, hic jacet, left to be lying and lying, so that some other form might emerge. In the book's epilogue, which Kaiama, you didn't address here, which I'm going to address, is the kind of turn that Morrison learned from her self-reflexive narrators. And that's that turn from the poiesis of their impulse to narrate to the desire to find how, the how of self-scrutiny. And this is the beauty and the braveness and the, the call to ring in a bell of this book. Why would a scholar, a feminist scholar of race and gender in the geocultural space of the Caribbean and its diasporas, not be compelled to have an extended conversation with those touchstones of her intellectual cum pedagogical inquiries? The Volta, to read for what she had become comfortable reading, is perhaps the closing gift of the book. Analysis, criticism, they have their own grammars and their syntaxes, their own copulas, and they create their own narrative forces. It takes courage to stop and turn and look into the theorized mirror to see a newly regarded self at work. Thank you so much, Kaiama.
Sadia.
Yeah, thank you, Kaiama, for this book. And I want to say, I have a question about Zuela, because I kind of want to exempt her from this company, but I think, okay, but I'll just go on with my remarks. Thank you for this book. How is regard possible for the enslaved and the colonized? Is self-regard a form of willfulness that reproduces the world as it refuses it? How is regard possible in an anti-Black world? Self-regard, an even more treacherous terrain to be embraced by the fungible, disposable, the violated, and the dead. Can the enslaved become inviolable and self-determined, as Lilith, the protagonist of the Book of Night Woman, would have us imagine? Are all refusals the same? Kaiama Glover invites us to consider such difficult questions in a regard itself. Glover explores what self-regard might mean for those who exercise no claim to the world, let alone a self. In this extended meditation on a cast of Black female anti-heroines, Glover proffers no easy answers to the lures and dangers of wanting a self untethered from community, or imagining oneself as a sovereign, willful individual in a world in which those terms are inextricably and indissolubly linked with slavery and conquest, with genocide and death, with man and his other. So how best to enter this difficult text? And yes, I would describe a regard itself as difficult because its claims are provocative and counterintuitive and unsettling and disturbing. It is rightly hesitant about endorsing the fictions of the self as liberatory, especially when these fictions can intensify subjection and the yoke of reproduction. Glover is involved in a process of resignification. How might one wrench regard from the scale of values that produces Black life as negligible, as property, as object, as fungible, as implement for man? How might one understand the importance of these texts to a Caribbean discourse, to theories of Black antisociality? How do we think freedom in anti-communal terms? And I don't actually know how, but how might one locate and extract some latent potential that resides in the terminology of the self, presumed to be bounded and separate from the group, from the multitude, a social isolate adrift from the unloved community, but relatively content? Can the individual or individualism be extracted from the structures of slavery, racial capitalism, coloniality, and the discursive foundations of liberal philosophy? Admittedly, this is a tall order. Glover proceeds with rigor and nuance and with a generous dose of caution about offering a plan for action or a lesson for living. She enters this uncertain and treacherous discursive terrain of I and will and mine and me, the terrain which distributes our death so regularly, so brutally, so excessively, so gratuitously, in good company with Morrison and Condé, Chauvet and Kincaid, among others. Let's start with Morrison and the web affiliation between a regard itself and the source of our self-regard, an essay in which Morrison reflects on writing Beloved, and in which the notion of regard figures centrally in writing a novel of slavery that is not a story of the institution or that reproduces its logic. Morrison speaks of the challenge of the problem. Quote, the problem is how to take the imaginative power, the artistic control away from the institution of slavery and place it where it belongs, in the hands of the person who knew it, certainly as well as anybody, and that would be the slaves. And this is quoted in chapter 5 of Kaiama's book. As important is Morrison's recognition that everyone surrounding Margaret Garner, from her mother-in-law to the abolitionists, there was this refusal to judge, the withdrawal from judgment, the refusal not to know, but to conclude. And there just seemed a little kernel of something in that. Why not judge her? Everybody else had, end quote. Morrison writes that she began Beloved looking at self-regard in both racial and gender terms, and how that self-regard evolves or is distorted or flourishes or collapses, and under what circumstances. I was interested in what contributed most significantly to slave woman's self-regard. What was her self-esteem? What value did she place on herself? The sources of this self-regard from Margaret Garner and Sethe, whether maternal, Morrison writes, but when Sethe asks, me, at the end of Beloved, it is a real movement toward a recognition of self-regard. Me remains an open-ended question, and this open-ended question reverberates across the pages of a regard itself. Like Morrison, Glover attends to the persons who knew and experienced the long history of dispossession, adopts the refusal to judge, and tries to understand what self-regard might mean in the context of enslavement and coloniality. Glover does not judge this cast of willful, unruly, narcissistic, and self-destructive women, and this enables her to fully consider the work of the novelist and the complex texture of the lives rendered. Hers is a reading in service of no other agenda than sitting with complexity and being unwilling, and an unwillingness to tether these practices of refusal to a politics of liberation or blueprint for freedom. The conundrum or constitutive antagonism is that in wanting to be an individual, quote, to be an individual with the full exercise of free will, these heroines find themselves wedded to the terms of their subjection and to the prevailing schema of value. The exercise of free will for Tituba or Lilith is actualized in the love of the overseer, the desire for a master, the willingness to be a slave, the opting for love instead of freedom. In writing these words, I can't help but hear Spiller's arresting declaration in Shades of Intimacy, Women in the Time of Revolution, quote, "There is no human loneliness and aloneness remotely comparable to the enslaved beyond the reach and scope of love and freedom. The day that the enslaved decides to act out the threat of death that always hangs over her head by risking her life is the first day of wisdom. The recognition that unless one is free, love cannot and will not matter," end quote. I would love for Kaiama to respond to this in the Q&A, and also maybe here to think about how the space of the Caribbean shifts this framework of love and freedom. For the characters of A Regard itself seem to assert the opposite as desiring agents, as narcissists affirming their beauty and value, as captives seeking the master's love. They are wedded to the value of a world structured on their death and dispossession, even as they imagine they are staking a claim to it, finding their place in it, seeking notice and recognition, esteeming what is special about them. Certainly this is the case with Lilith and Tituba, with Tituba coming to desire her servitude, choosing to be a slave for love, and Lilith unearthing self-regard in an anti-Black world by embracing everything, quote, unnigger-like, like a lady of good breeding and learning, green eyes, British letters, romance, pink nipples, a sense of beauty and her uniqueness defined over and against the community of slaves. The entanglement or identity of will and servitude do not go unremarked by Glover, which is why she never offers this cast of characters as a pantheon of feminist icons, even as she hopes to excavate their radical demands. Like Morrison, she wants us to know them, understand their contradictions, accept their flaws, and yet withhold judgment. What is it that one might do when in all essential ways the capacity to do it all or to act in the world and against the world has been foreclosed or is met with such great punishment? The complete program for disorder and the capacity for destruction and destitution, something Zuela and Setha both know, certainly provide the opportunity to do in a way that doesn't reproduce the world that turns against you. They try to undo and strike back against the logic of that world through an unwillingness to reproduce the world and its values. This is not the case for the others who want to see themselves as empowered and of value in this world. Glover is not willing to sidestep this thorny entanglement of issues and forces us as readers to wade in the thicket of them. Not surprisingly, we are pricked and wounded. How can self-regard yield so easily to reproduction, not physical procreation, but to the social reproduction of the world that turns against them. What distinguishes Zuela is her understanding of the worlding of the world, its episteme, its ontology, its taxonomy of values, and she tries to destitute the colonizer's world on all fronts, not through solidarity, but through affirmation and destruction, through an embrace of death. Glover is as unflinching as she is unsentimental. The story of Black female self-regard is double-edged, and self-regard formulated along lines not unlike the captive maternal, for whom the capacity of making and doing ties her to and reproduces the very order that is harming her, that is killing her. Glover, fully cognizant of this, is reluctant to elevate these practices of refusal to a radical or revolutionary program. Rather, she underscores how inassimilable or indigestible these practices are to the revolutionary project, or even to emancipation with all its limit. A regard itself is not an affirmation of the agency of the enslaved or of colonized women. Rather, it is an exploration of the conundrum of being the kind of dispossessed life who wants to say, I am different, I want what I want, I own myself, I possess value. And in a world where such aspirations and sentiments are the brick and mortar of the plantation, the colony, the racial enclosure, the neoliberal order. With all of this duly noted, Glover proceeds rigorously and thoughtfully to unpack such aspirations, to explore what they make possible and the damage they inflict. One of the most powerful aspects of this project is one of the most powerful aspects of this project of resolute self-sufficiency or self-interest over and above community is the attempt to refuse the work of social reproduction and sustaining collective life. But short of a revolutionary practice, like other captive maternals, this valiant attempt to refuse the given nonetheless reproduces the terms of order.
Thank you, Sadia. So I think Kaiama, you're going to take a few minutes to respond to these really rich commentaries. I see that questions have started to appear in the Q&A, and just a reminder to everyone that if you have a question or a comment, please write it there. Kaiama.
Yes, okay, so I'm looking at the time and I'm looking at my notes and I'm thinking how to do this. And I will try to answer in ways that perhaps weave together some of the things that I'm hearing and some of the direct questions posed to me there at the end. So I suppose to start, I just want to say, and Saidia, you brought this feeling back into me, which is the extent to which there is so much heartbreak in the me and in the I. And so in response to that heartbreak, both presented by these characters and by these works, and then elicited from me and us as readers of these works, I think what I'm asking for is, how do we practice empathy in the face of what looks like failure, in the way that you ended, right? In the failure to undo order. That's where I started, really, with the frustration of the unforgiving nature of the order that, despite all the rocks you throw, still sort of bounce back and do harm to you. And I wanted to query my own empathy, and I appreciate, I love your refusal, Regine. I love that you spent so much time laying out how tough it is to get behind this idea of being empathetic towards characters who fail at the task we want them to have succeeded at. But I guess what I'm asking for is how do we avoid absolute pessimism in thinking about that failure? And then how do we think about the violence we do as readers in our own refusals to read them, our refusals to see their efforts, and to think deeply about, well, what are we expecting? What are we expecting? Are we expecting an enslaved woman to do all this kind of work? Are we expecting even a white Creole woman who's been adored by her community to become the beacon enlightening the masses that purport to love her, but actually sacrifice her over and over again? And so really just a call to think about the immense risk and vulnerability attendant to each one of these women's practices of self-regard. And I'm seeing a question in the chat that this answer may get to as well, the incredible risk and vulnerability of the authors. And it was very interesting to me, part of what's so amazing about having the three of you respond to this is your different and revealing reactions to the book. Yvette's desire to dance with these characters aligns very much with the kind of emotional and physical connection that I felt I had to these women, and the fact that, I didn't end up like loving them, or no, that's not true. I didn't end up liking them or thinking they had wanted something, but I did end up loving them in that human way, and being willing to accept what they were able to accomplish. And so two things specifically, one thing not specific and one thing more specific about Zuela. So just in general, I would say, if it hasn't been made clear already, there's something desperate and visceral about these efforts at self-regard. And I think in time that has become enough for me as a model of resistant and, dare I say, and I got all the scare quotes around it, resilient behavior. And I go into what resilience is and isn't in this book. The desperation and the viscerality of this response, of this refusal, to me, is a fair starting point, and in some ways maybe a fairer starting point than our desires for revolution. I think that's part of what I'm trying to say. And then even thinking about Zuela, and I understand why she seems like something of an outlier, because she gets to, and Halberstam is all over this, she gets to the wild space, right, where she is in sustained contestation of the order. But I cannot overlook the fact that at the end of that novel, she confesses to wanting to. She confesses to wanting to serve as an example for the world she left behind. And to me, that's a tethering to community that actually keeps her not in a space of nihilism and total revolution, but in this space of desperate longing. As I say a couple of times, I think in the book, of just wishing the world were better so that she could be in it. And so for that reason, while Zuela does seem to escape in ways more tangible, necessarily so, than the two enslaved women, than a zombie, and then an impoverished, orphaned person in the midst, who finds herself a kind of pawn of war in major political battles. Yeah, Zuela gets somewhere, but I was very struck and even thought productively contradictory that she ends up expressing, I wish that what I'm doing, what I have done, how I have lived my life could be more acceptable, and that I didn't have to escape the world in order to be me. So yes, I think because there's quite, I don't know what you think as moderator, Madeline, there's more I could say, but maybe I should answer questions.
I think it would be great to go to the questions, because I think they're echoing and building on some of the things that you're already saying. So you alluded to one of the questions already, so maybe we could take that one and package it with a second question, because they're both about the discipline and practices of literary criticism. So Gary Wilder mentions that the authors that you're speaking about have been criticized, intensely for figuring these kinds of women and for the way that they've written about communities. So can you say more about this aspect of your study and how it invites us now to practice a kind of critical self-reflexivity regarding our investments and maybe even transferential relations to objects of study? And I'm going to ask a second question from David Norman, who mentions that you alluded to a certain tension that might exist between African American critical theorizing and Caribbean literary studies.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for those questions. There's so much in the questions that I know we're not going to get to. So I'll just say thank you on the whole, because obviously every time there's engagement with your work, you get better at understanding what you've done. So thank you. To answer Gary and David's question about sort of the critical context around the publication and circulation of these novels, yes, I think maybe, just maybe, the beating heart of this, and you may suspect this already, Gary, and Regine certainly knows this as well. I think the beating heart of this novel began with the Depestre book, actually, the place where I saw that the folks who I said this in my introduction, the folks whose work I use and teach constantly, meaning my critical crew, I felt was not only not giving this novel the attentive consideration it deserved, but was maybe misreading it. And this didn't make sense to me because of the kind of work I know they do. And so it became about figuring out what was wrong with this woman in this book. And what was wrong with this woman, the character Adriana, and this book, I then realized, of course, carried into some of the other works that I ended up writing about. And notably, I would say how certain desires around the production of literature in the Caribbean, and I would say the global South more broadly, but I won't die on that sword. My specialty is the Caribbean. There's a hope that we attach as critics to what they will represent and the interventions that they'll make. That we wear like these backpacks as we're turning the pages, and we can't help it. I mean, this is the work that we do. We read and we close read, and we have some of the stories in our head already. So what do we do with a text or a character that is saying no to what we want? And in the case of the Depestre in particular, the critical context was so explosive around the novel and led me back to a more broad criticism of the individualism of this author and his way of writing women, that then helped me to create tools to ask for reflexivity in these other texts as well. So I'll leave that there for the moment and then carry on to David's question about the tension between African-American critical theorization and that of Caribbean literary studies. You know, these were some of the weeds of the book. We're thinking about how I, as an African-American woman and whose kind of pre-Caribbean studies life was African-American studies, and my reliance on, and of course, Toni Morrison, Hortense Spillers, Saidia, and others who are the canon of Black American studies in some ways. I wanted to move into the spaces that were idiosyncratically Caribbean, as I said. And one of those in particular is the question of, I said it briefly, majority Blackness, right? So spaces where one's gendered and racialized being, when one is racialized into the majority, and yet instill by various nuances, either of phenotype or class attached to phenotype, create a very specific experience that's less able to be accounted for by the theorization of US Blackness, where part of resistance has to do with a constant butting up against immediate whiteness. And so that's one way in which kind of the theoretical conceptualization of this book is squarely Caribbean. And other ways, I would say, are obviously the specifics of cultural, spiritual, and environmental realities that attach to the island spaces. Obviously, I don't have time to go into all of them, but at the very least, the question of Vodou, the question of immediately proximate indigeneity, or a sense of the immediate haunting of the indigenous. These, I think, are realities that are part of the islands that are perhaps more diluted I found in US Black studies. So, you know, tension, I don't know, tension implies conflict. I don't think I want to, I don't mean that, but tension just insofar as fissures and openings in different directions that I hoped to explore in the book.
Kaiama, there are a couple of questions that really deal with gender identity. So Jack Halberstam asks, what is the role of the erotic in the production of disorder in these works? And observes that Zuela refuses womanhood at one point in her long withdrawal from the colonial order. How should we understand the bodily position of woman through your readings? And Marie Larose asks if you could talk a little bit more about self-regard in the refusal of motherhood. And can we talk about a rethinking or reimagining of motherhood through these erotics?
Okay. I feel competent in my mind for everything except that last question is going to involve more thinking, the erotics of motherhood, but give me a minute on that. In terms of the erotic and disorder throughout these works, I suppose one of the bigger questions I was asking myself, or the things that I was looking at throughout the book, is when, in principle, the erotic is not meant to be there, when it feels inappropriate, uncomfortable, or unwelcome in a movement toward freedom, for example, or when there are bigger fish to fry, politically, socially, and otherwise. And so to the extent to which so much of the adamant individualism of each one of the women I think about here is not just an expression of their sexuality out of a space of pure desire, but a reactive expression of that sexuality. So to the extent to which they understand their sexuality as disordering, to the extent to which Tituba in the Puritan Americas understands that when she's teaching these tween white girls to dance, she's doing something sexy that's not allowed in that society, and she's making that point as an offering, in addition to being able herself to express bodily sexual freedom. Or when thinking about Zuela, who just, her sexuality is one of domination that fully acknowledges the extent to which everyone thinks they can dominate her. It's not an aside, it's a practice. It's a practice of a refusal. When she orders those who should be in a position of mastery to be submissive to her, one has to see that as a freedom practice to some extent. Whether or not that's an entire success, I don't think it necessarily is. But I suppose, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about failure and success, I'm giving a lot of credit to the effort and modeling that effort in these relations. And I think, each one, I've mentioned two, but each one of these disorderly characters similarly is conscious of the way in which her sexuality is resistive and recalcitrant with respect to the wider society. Self-regard in the refusal of motherhood. I mean, there's ways in which that's cliche, certainly. But I do think it remains bold and worth examining in a particularly Caribbean context. Maybe that's another way in which I do want to look at the Caribbean. And so, someone's chatting to me. Yes, so self-regard and refusal of motherhood. I think that in each instance, the precarity of maintaining a coherent and viable self, each of these women, or more and less adamantly, each of these women recognizes the threat to which trying also to assume responsibility for a dependent being would be a risk to that selfness that they're simply not willing to take. Zuela most aggressively so, which is why I include this, the long passage about a violent refusal of motherhood. There's some way in which I think she articulates the softer premise that motherhood can be an extractive phenomenon when it comes to self-regard.
It looks as though Saidia, you have your hand up, maybe to jump in there.
I just wanted to ask, some follow-up questions with that. And that was about, so then does like kind of ungendering as a concept, do you feel that we can extend that to the Caribbean productively or not? And then I also wanted you to speak more to like, is love and freedom, does it refigure itself, differently there? And I know you're trying to say like, anti-Blackness may be different and, in the context of a majority Black society. But so I just wanted to, to think about how our critical models travel and where they don't, or what the limits are.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and what you just asked gets to the part of Jack's question that I didn't get to, which is ungendering and the position and the bodily positioning of woman. Yeah, I think it's funny that Yvette and you, Saidia, and Jack here, and me right now in answering, I want to talk about Zuela. And it's maybe because she does it so, she's the most obvious in her querying with and without the extra E of womanhood. She and Lilith, I would say, to an extent as well. And in a different way, Adriana. So let me see if I can do this. So Zuela very much in recognizing the near impossibility of her having power, the near impossibility of her having power in society within her woman's body, but that being offset to a degree by her delighting in her own body, something that carries through each one of these novels. So on the one hand, where we have this scene after her abortion, where she cuts her hair off, puts on overalls, and attempts to sort of present as an ungendered or masculine subject. This cannot be undone by the amount of time also she spends with her hands in her pants, or caressing her own breasts, or smelling her own armpits, or reveling in her womanhood. I mean, so in this respect, I do think that, here and elsewhere in this corpus, this question of the bodily position of woman is about some measure of reclaiming, of being very cognizant of the imposed definition of womanhood, be that in this wealthy Haitian community in Jacmel for Adriana, or in the Puritan society that Tituba is grappling with, among the enslaved women on the plantation in Montpellier, etc., that each of these women articulates a clear understanding of what woman is and should be in the context that they're in, and spends a great portion of their thinking of themselves, of their looking in the mirror, of them touching their own bodies, in a state of poesis, trying to unmake that imposed definition and propose another. It's not always coherent. It's not always stable and or progressive toward an aim, but it is, I think, consistently unsettling and, as I said before, resistant. And thinking about whether or not our theory travels. I mean, of course, yes and no. The bigger questions of gender, of promiscuity, of mastery and submission certainly travel across the hemispheric Americas, including from the United States to the Caribbean, and certainly recognizing the extent to which the Caribbean is diasporically in the United States. That being said, I would insist on the absolute specificity and arrangement of battling the prejudice of color and battling internalized anti-Blackness in spaces wherein the very national cultural identity is meant to have conquered anti-Blackness, at least intellectually and emotionally in a certain kind of way. So what the different feeling of having having that kind of gaslighting, maybe, that comes from knowing that you continue to experience a particularly gendered form of anti-Blackness as you make your way through a world that insists that Black is beautiful and Black is who we are. So I think that specificity is something that I try to think about in the Caribbean context as separate.
There are a number of other really interesting questions, but I know that we are running out of time. So maybe we could just end on a question that's been raised about the book cover. So Laura Vargas says that she loves the book cover and wonders if you could talk about it a little bit.
This is by an artist who I adore. Her name is Mafalda Mondestin. If you're interested in other examples of her work, you may simply look over this shoulder and you will see in my virtual background, this is about a 6 by 4 foot paper laser cut mobile hanging from the ceiling of the gallery, the Louise McCagg Gallery, as part of an exhibition of work by Haitian American women, Haitian and Haitian diasporic women artists that we put up about a year, literally actually a year ago today. This is Mafalda's work. On the wall here is work by Nathalie Jolivet, 10 by 16 foot mural, oil mural. And on the ground and running up sort of the wall that I'm sitting in front of is a sculptural installation by Tessa Mars. The cover of the book is a sketch that Mafalda Mondestin made in preparation actually for this exhibit. And I don't know that she ever planned to do anything with it, but I saw it and it seemed to me to say everything I spent a lot of words trying to say, which is the tension between sort of being captured in the regard of others, but also having some measure of capacity to look back. So these, and then the under the subtext of that, for those who know, right? So the wink to an informed reader, viewer, is that these are the bottles in which the tibonange, meaning the sort of the captive spirit of zombified beings, are kept as they are separated from their mechanical body that is meant to labor outside in the world. So there is something, as I said earlier, insofar as the Depestre book was the springboard in some ways, this is an excerpt from this visualization is an excerpt from that novel that I think speaks to the inevitability of being regarded despite our efforts to gaze on ourselves exclusively. So yes, thank you for that question, Laura. And can I say thank you again? You all have heard it in email, you heard it earlier, I will say it again, and I'll be saying it for a while. Thank you so much for helping me celebrate this book and for being in this virtual space with me. I can't tell you how much it means. Thank you.
Congratulations again, Kaiama, and thanks to all of the discussants. I think this has really been a very rich conversation. Thank you to everybody else for attending. Thanks to the Heyman Center. If you would like to have your own copy of A Regarded Self, and I'm sure that you would, there is a link in the chat that you can click on, and there's a discount that you can access via that link. So on that note, I think we'll just say bye-bye. Thanks to everyone. Bye-bye.